الله أكبر الله أكبر.
Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Islamic Center at New York University podcast, coming to you straight from the heart of New York City. We're building an amazing Muslim community here at ICNYU where everyone is welcomed and respected no matter where you're from or where you're at. This is the place to be. So open your ears and your heart and come along with us on another life-changing journey. Bismillah.
Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So we're on chapter 12 of the text. If people want to pull it up, it's called the Book of Assistance by Imam Haddad. We got through the first part of the 12th chapter last week on religious obligations. So if you have a smartphone or a laptop, you can just Google the Book of Assistance PDF and it'll pop up, so we can kind of work through the text all together. And for those who aren't familiar with the text or it's your first time here, we've been going through this piece by piece over the course of some months. All the previous sessions are up on our podcast and YouTube channel, so you can catch up there. But essentially what the text is introducing is in very easily digestible formats, a process to spirituality. And so what Imam al-Haddad is doing is providing a roadmap to us in terms of our own spiritual journey. And going through this delineated piece by piece, you can see for those who have been here for more than just one or two chapters, it presents a lot of different methods and avenues towards engagement of our spirituality. Right? It's not only ritual and practice or only theology or only ethics and values or only kind of lessons around personal development, but it's a culmination of all of these things, because everything goes into impacting our heart, essentially. But we're in the second part of this chapter on religious obligations. And so for those who remember from last week, what Imam al-Haddad is introducing here now into this chapter is not just about the performance of the fara'id, but what is it that is the essential yield from engaging in actions that are obligatory as well as actions that are supererogatory, recommended, the mustahab and nafila acts. And what he roots this in is love. That just like you have physical exercise that is going to inculcate and yield certain kind of outcomes, right? If I work out a certain part of my body in an exercise, it's not going to then deepen and strengthen other parts of my body. So you could go swimming and that could be a holistic exercise. You could run and it could impact your body in some capacity on a whole. But if you isolate a particular muscle, it's going to then work out that muscle. So doing an exercise that engages a bicep isn't going to necessarily make your calf muscle bigger. Doing something that engages a tricep isn't going to necessarily make your quad bigger, or vice versa. But there's yields from the spiritual exercise. So the performance of the fara'id, as well as the performance now of the mustahab and nafila, the supererogatory acts, their yield is meant to be something that increases in love. Both the aspect of the love of the divine that one would have for God, but also in being able to recognize and feel the presence of God's love towards you. And to recap one of the things that we said last week, that is when Allah is defined to us in the Quran, we're given an insight into who Allah is. He is described as being qareeb, like close to us. But God is never described as being ba'id, at a distance from us. So if there is a feeling of distance from the divine, the notion isn't rooted in an idea that that's because Allah is away from us, but removing anything that is rooted in anthropomorphic understandings, the recognition of a heart that feels distant from the creator of the heart is more of a product of being able to recognize, well, what's getting in the way that doesn't allow for me to feel the presence of God in my life, to feel the presence of Allah's love, Allah's mercy? What's getting in the way that becomes difficult? And one of the things that Imam al-Haddad is saying here, that of the potential yields of what is the fara'id, what are the supererogatory acts, the obligatory acts, is this capacity to now yield this love that enables us to just see things differently. So when somebody teaches you, why are the obligations important, right? Why are the prohibitions things you want to avoid? It's not just in this elementary sense of good and bad and right and wrong, but the opportunity to understand that what is in addition to what is obligatory is done now purely out of want and has the capacity, the same way where some of you in this room might be able to explain to us, when you eat certain foods, why are they good for your body? When you eat certain foods, why are they problematic for your body? But most of us, we don't know what this stuff is actually doing to us. We couldn't explain the intricacies of it. Here, you don't have to yield to the idea of being able to explain it, but this is what the exercise does. Right? My servant draws nearer to me with nothing more pleasing to me than what I have made obligatory upon him, and then continues to draw nearer to me with supererogatory devotions until I love him. And when I love him, I become his hearing with which he hears, his sight with which he sees, his hand with which he strikes, and his foot with which he walks, so that by me he hears, by me he sees, by me he strikes, and by me he walks. Should he ask me, I surely shall grant him his request. Should he ask me for protection, I shall surely protect him. Never do I hesitate in anything as I hesitate in taking the soul of my believing servant. He dislikes death, and I dislike to displease him, but it is a thing inevitable. So when somebody would ask, well, where is it then that there becomes this relationship that seemingly at its surface is transactional, but at its base is not actually transactional? The notion isn't that you ask of God or request of God, and then God is the one that is going to fulfill your requests, or that you seek protection from Allah, and only then will Allah protect you. But the understanding is that you come to the realization that your trust ultimately is in God and God alone, because nothing else is fundamentally going to be what fulfills your dua. Nothing else is going to be what offers that sense of protection to you other than the source of ultimate protection. And recognizing that now with the nuance of what it is that's being said, because whether you are aware of it or not, Allah is the one that is providing you with provision. Right? My son was just in here. My daughter was just in here. If I sat them down and said, I am the one that gives you food. I am the one that gives you your shelter. I am the means of your provision. My understanding of theology is off from an Islamic perspective. I could be a mechanism or a means through which it is gotten to them, but I am not my child's provider. God is my child's provider. I am not the one that is the source of provision. And so the mechanism of utilizing what is beyond just base obligation creates now the opportunity to have these veils lifted that allow for the contentment of the heart to be gained through only what it is that gives it real appeasement, this type of understanding and knowledge. So when you're sitting and you're thinking, hey, should I actually pray my sunnahs after Maghrib? Yeah, like you should. Should I be in a place where I extend a salam? Because one of the few instances where a sunnah act actually exceeds a fard act is in giving a greeting of peace. Because it's not an obligation to give the greeting of peace, the initiation of it. You don't have to say, Assalamu alaikum to the person sitting next to you the way you have to pray Fajr. But once the salam is given, the response to it becomes now a communal obligation to respond to. Somebody gives the salam, the respond is categorically distinct, but the initiation of a recommended act uniquely in the giving of a salam, is one of the few instances where doing something that's recommended outweighs in its worth doing something that's an obligation. Do you see what I'm saying? But for the purposes of what this is, when you're acting upon it, you're not leaving it behind. What it then does is yield you this. And it allows for that reliance to start to come up. You want to be persons who live in this world the way that the birds do, the hadith say. They leave with their stomachs empty and they return back full. There's a sense of tawakkul in something that isn't about putting your back against the wall in a state of defense, but in a place where you start to really think, is my reliance more on that dollar than on the one that's giving me provision? Do I put more trust in what it is that the dunya offers to me, rather than recognizing my trust isn't even in an akhirah, but my trust is in the one that's in the creator of the dunya and the akhirah? And what allows for me to experience that? What allows for me to understand it? And then in this narration, it's closed off within the prism of death. What I'd like for you to do is turn to the persons next to you and talk this out. If you haven't been here before, the idea is for us to discuss so we can benefit from each other's insights, but you're also not just engaged in a front-facing discussion that becomes something that you're just told what to think, and you're not using your faculties to think about it and make it concrete. So in this first paragraph, where we have this hadith where the Prophet ﷺ is saying that Allah says, and he then quotes this hadith in its entirety, "My servant draws nearer to me with nothing more pleasing to me." Read that hadith in its entirety and then think, why does it close with a discussion on death? Because there's nothing without meaning in what Allah says and what Allah's messenger says. It's not a hodgepodge of words that get stuck together, but he brings this to a place of kind of a closure in a statement. What is the relevancy now that this thing of the reflection on transitioning from this world has to do with this? If you don't have the text in front of you, you can just Google the Book of Assistance, PDF, by Imam al-Haddad. We're on chapter 12 on religious obligations. If you can just turn towards the person next to you, what are you taking from that narration on a whole? But why does he interject death's mention into it at the end of it? Why is it something that kind of brings, how does that bring a close to the entirety of what the meaning is? And then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. If you don't know the names of the people sitting around you, try to learn their names, kind of get to know them a little bit as well. And if somebody's sitting next to you or behind you and they're not talking to anybody, include them in the discussion, and then we'll go from there. Okay, so what are some of the things that are coming up? What are we discussing? What are we talking about? Yeah. The importance of?
The importance of doing the extra actions, you know, as far as so that so much so that he loves us in the sense that decided to be here, you walk, strength, Allah will grant your request. So yeah, sorry, have to be a little louder.
But why is he concluding with this reminder around death? Why? Yeah. Why are you tired?
Listen, I'm kind of weak, y'all, but I'm good. I'm good.
You're like 20 years old. You don't have any reason to be tired.
Lost on Monday, but that's okay.
Yeah? It's going to be a great week for you. Yeah, go ahead.
We were discussing that the hadith is stating a lot of things that not only seem perfect, but they are perfect, you know, only connection and then this perfect relationship. But at the same time, death is a thing that's going to happen anyway. So if you want a perfect life, then when you have God to be your eyes and your ears and how you walk, then life is perfect. And even bad things, you perceive them in a good way, or you perceive them with the trust in Allah. But there's something that we cannot run from, which is that death feels hard. And I guess the Prophet ﷺ said when he was dying, he said that, I don't know how to say that in English, but the moments of dying, they're not easy, and it's not easy to go through it. So if I think I was discussing that if the hadith concluded without saying the sentence, if I'm thinking about this perfect relationship and perfect things, I'll feel like, then why will death come and, you know, ruin everything? And regardless how religious I am, death will be bad, and I will hate it, and I will feel scared and uncomfortable and everything. So I think mentioning that it is a proactive kind of approach, so that when these kind of questions come to our mind, Allah is telling us, I know that it's a bad thing and that it has to happen, but yeah, as what you said, that Allah is saying that this is the thing that I hesitate the most when I'm doing. So being proactive by saying, and even if all of this perfection will end in something that's challenging and might seem tough, I'm really hesitant about it, but it is what it is, and it's okay. So just to close the whole picture.
Anything else? Other thoughts? Yeah.
Is it because when you love someone, you want to be with them, and Allah says that He loves that person, and in the end you will be with them after you die? So that's where.
Yeah, go ahead.
We talk about this idea that in death, like, I think two things happen at the same time. Right? So like we talk about the idea like Allah created us to know Him and to love Him, right? Like in that person's death, that person ceases being able to like worship Allah, right? And also on the other side, the person can worship Allah for their own benefit either. So like to take the life of the like a true servant, kind of two things at once at the same time. One is that worshiper, and then worship is like to gain worship.
You're gonna say something?
Yeah, I'm just thinking that this life is just a dream, and so when Allah talks about death, and this is to wake us up, right? You know, first essentially. And so we have the taste of death when we wake up. So by mentioning death, it's almost reminded of other purposes to do this.
Yeah. There's a lot that's there, but we want to unpack all of its meanings, right? You want to be able to delve deep into these narrations, into ayat, and to understand that we don't want reductive approaches to religion, but to be able to think and reflect and extrapolate on it. The hadith in its entirety is giving an opportunity now for a person who has accountability to be in a place where they are determining categorically where and how they're going to choose the actions that they engage in, and to have a recognition now that quite often when we talk about actions from the standpoint of Islam in terms of realities, not just realities that are worldly but otherworldly, the only thing that you take when you leave from here are the acts that you did while you were here. That's the only thing that really kind of goes forward with you. There's nothing else that goes with you. Right? I love my kids. You see them running around here sometimes. I don't take them with me. I don't take wealth. I don't take like stuff, right? It doesn't go with me. The only thing that carries over with you when you go from here are the things that you did, deeds. That's what gets presented to Allah. Deeds, actions, choices. And you got to deepen in understanding. Like, what is an action within this tradition? Right? There's hadith where the Prophet ﷺ tells his companions to be smart about what you say, smart about your words. And they ask, like, are you saying we're going to be accountable for the words that we say? Because they're not recognizing speech as an action, the way sitting is an act, Standing is an act. Drinking is an act. Eating is an act. You can think about these as actions that you undertake. The idea of a deed is something that is a little bit bigger than just what we might think about, if we're even thinking about what actions in and of themselves are. And then when you get to this place where you move forward, it's the only thing that you can take with you. Whether you want it to happen or not, regardless of whether you're a person of faith or not, there's nobody that lives forever. There's some people whose lifespans are longer than other people's lifespans, but there's no one that exists in dunya eternally. The place of eternal existence is in the akhirah, right? May Allah make us all people of Jannah. So all you're taking with you are going to be deeds. All you're taking with you are going to be actions. So if you're going to act, why not act on things that are going to give you an increase in love? If you have an inevitable stop to the time in which you can do, why are you going to do things that are going to then yield other things? Because if these are the acts that then increase in love, you can juxtapose those to actions that then increase in what? If you smoke something or drink something, it's going to increase you in what? Complacency. You're going to have to do it more and more often in order for you to yield what it is that's temporary satisfaction, not contentment. When you gossip, when you backbite, when you lie, when you cheat, what is it increasing you in that moment? When you're in a place where you don't keep a promise, you can't yield what can only be yielded through the performance of an act. And if you don't have mindfulness in the act in and of itself, it doesn't need your presence in order for it to still raise and increase what takes place through the performance of an action. Do you get what I mean? So if I engage in activity that just increases mindlessness, then that's what it's going to do. And it doesn't need for me to be mindful of the mindlessness that it increases in order for it to increase that. If you ruminate instead of contemplate, you're just building toxicity in your heart. Do you get what I'm saying? Does this make sense? And you only get a limited amount of time to do it. So if you really think about, well, what's the point of these actions that I'm putting into the world? What are they increasing in me? Increasing in the recipient of it? When I throw out all of these things that are coming from me, what is it really gaining from me? Like, you know why you chase after certain things supposedly, but what is the trade-off that comes? So the same way you can incentivize. I do X amount of hours of work in order to yield Y amount of provision in the form of monetary compensation. The formula is really easy to understand. Do you ever think about what the yield is from the actions that you're engaged in? What are you really gaining from what it is that you're doing? And those deeds, that's all that you're going to take with you. So this is why we have verses in the Quran, hadith in our tradition, where angels will come to people on the day of judgment. And forget about doing a ton of garbage, a ton of things that are hurtful, or a ton of things that are just like engaged in detriment. There's going to be people's books that when they look at the books, the angels are going to say, how long did you even live in the world? And the individual is going to say, maybe I was just there for a day. Because it doesn't match up. An entire life lived, but a book that has nothing in it. And so it's saying that, hey, why don't you engage in acts that are going to be outwardly and inwardly beneficial, as opposed to things that are just outwardly beneficial? Why are you chasing after things that forget about what they mean in terms of the next world or this world alone in terms of its apparency? They don't even make it to your books when you go and stand in front of God. There's just nothing to it. It's futile. It's pointless. Did you tell anybody in the last week of your life, thank you, with sincerity? And who is it that gets to be recipient of your gratitude? Who is it that has the privilege of hearing that you appreciate them? Because somebody worked hard to make that cup of coffee for you. Somebody worked hard to cook the food that you ordered. Somebody works hard to stand, to open the door to your apartment building. Somebody works hard to vacuum the carpet of the room that we're sitting in. Likely, it wasn't you or I that did these things. 2 weeks ago, when we came in here and we weren't sitting on the couches because they were washed, they weren't just washed on their own. Somebody washed them so you would have a clean seat to sit in. And then when you can think that the recommended act is to express gratitude, this is what the hadith says, that he who is not thankful of people is not thankful of the divine. How can that act not increase in love when you can with real graciousness express gratitude? Do you get what I'm saying? With real sense of presence, visit the sick. Take care of orphans. Be kind to the elders. Don't forget about the state of those who have nothing to eat. Do you see what I mean? Versus you put now into perspective that anything that the Quran and the Hadith are calling you towards is not to your detriment. Why is it bad to be kind to people? Versus now a plethora of actions that render consequently not just deception and malintent. That's a bad thing. May Allah protect us from it. But if it renders now indifference, it kills compassion, it destroys empathy. How many acts in a day do you engage in that's what it's taking away from you? Increasing in consideration. Do you understand? So here, this is what happens. And when you try to think at one capacity, the link between what I was saying before and how it works, that Allah provides for you, whether you are conscious of it or not. So when your seeing becomes the seeing of the divine, when your movements and mechanisms are now influenced from the presence of the divine, whether somebody appreciates God or not, God is still giving to them everything that God gives to them. That is the mode through which you will traverse this worldly existence. In whatever human capacity you can, تَخَلَّقُوا بِأَخْلَاقِ اللَّهِ, you embody now the characteristics of the divine. So you don't love somebody because of who they are, you love somebody because of who you are. You don't treat somebody a certain way based off of who they are. God doesn't feed you because you're worthy of the feeding. God feeds you because He feeds you. You're not kind only to select people, you're kind to everybody. Why do only certain people of certain cultures and races get to eat at your dinner table? Why, when you go to certain places, do you have affinity to people who share skin color with you? Allah feeds everybody. So when your eyes start to be seeing this world through the vision of the divine, then you start to see the beauty in everybody. Not just people whose hands match your hands in terms of country of origin, in terms of social class. Do you get what I'm saying? This is what love does. It removes blocks. So when you have a choice to pray your sunnahs, pray them. When you have a choice to exert on what is extra, don't do the minimum. But be in a place where you are thinking about what the overall gain is. And as he goes through it, as we're looking at the next couple of paragraphs that we read, the other gain to this, he says, is that the extra acts, they compensate for what was deficient in the obligatory. So you have deficiencies in your fard prayers, then the recommended prayers are what are going to fill the gaps, right? This is also there. The angels, they come, they say that these guys, they didn't pray all their prayers. Allah says, go back and look and see if they did anything extra. Your God looks for a reason to accept from you. You didn't fulfill the fara'id. The angels come and they say they didn't fulfill the fara'id. Allah says, go and see if they did anything that was beyond the fara'id, that can come as a compensation for the gaps in what was fard. And then we got to the end of the page where he was saying that you don't want to perform the obligations and avoid the prohibitions in a way where you give more weight to a recommended act over an obligatory act. So you got to do the base minimum of the obligations and not focus on things that are recommended before the fara'id are fulfilled. And we're at the last paragraph on page 44. Know that you will never attain the performing of obligations. Can somebody start reading from there? This is where we ended last week. So know that you will never attain to the performing of obligations. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Know that you will never attain to the performing of obligations, the avoiding of the prohibited things, and the performance of the supererogatory acts that he has laid down for you to draw near to him, save through knowledge. Seek it then, for he has said, may blessings and peace be upon him. Seeking knowledge is an obligation upon every Muslim. Knowledge makes you aware of what is the duty, what is recommended, what is forbidden, how to perform your duties and recommended acts, and how to avoid what is prohibited. Therefore, you must have knowledge and cannot dispense with it. For on the practice of it, your happiness is in the world and the hereafter depends. Know that those who worship but have no knowledge end up receiving more harm from their worship than benefit. How many worshippers have tired himself out in worshiping while persistently committing a sin which he believed to be an act of obedience, or at any rate, not a sin? Okay,
let's take a pause here. Right? So here we have this kind of call to the seeking of ilm, which we've talked about before when he talked about having a wird, right, in the previous chapter, that you need to have a regular practice of increasing in knowledge. Where and how that becomes now a subjective decision. Knowledge in and of itself can be rooted in sacred sciences, but it's also just learning and continuing to learn things. But not getting to a place where your baseline understanding subjectively is determining where and how you give weight to things. So it's not I think that something is good or bad. It's not I feel something is good or bad. It's not that in my opinion something is good or bad, right? You can have viewpoints. Viewpoints are different from opinions. Opinions become absolute where they don't necessarily need to be absolute. You can have perspective, you can have experiences, but certain things, they don't necessarily work in that way. And sometimes people get to places where they're exerting understandings that are not rooted in something that make it much harder. And that baseline understanding of it comes from recognizing foundational principles in this religion. If I was to ask you to define for me what the word haram means, its technical definition, could you do it? And you got to think about that inwardly. At this stage of your life, if you converted to Islam, you're not Muslim, it's a little different. And if you converted to Islam like a week ago, a month ago, a year ago, or you're exposed to Muslims who they don't give you other than what they possess. I sat with somebody earlier today who is asking me questions in this realm of haram and fard and whatever. And it's hard because we're given terms without meanings, and we're given terms also without reflections on God. So if you learn the word fard and haram experientially before anyone taught you to celebrate the divine in your life, you were told to pray your sunnah prayers before you were taught whose sunnah you're following, then it's not going to feel empowering. You're just doing ritual because somebody said do this or you're bad. And then what escapes from us is also the meaningfulness of this that has an actual structure to it. It's not at random. It's not chaotic. There's an actual order that when you yield to it, it's got this intrinsic beauty to it. That when you can see it in that way and recognize it for what it is that it actually offers, that is delineated with an understanding of a creator who gets his creation. It all starts to line up in ways that make sense. If you can learn what the word fard means, what is its actual definition? What makes something fard? How is that determined? And then when you can see that in these boxes of what is haram and fard, there's not actually so much that goes into it. And then in the boxes that are in between, what is mustahab, recommended, what is makruh, disliked, what is mubah, just neutral. There's a lot more that errs on the end of permissible, halal, than what is in that little box of what is haram. And where and how someone starts to equip themselves. Not to be in the place where I'm the one that's like teaching people constantly, or I'm the one that's rectifying. No, man, throw that nonsense out the window. Make it about your heart. And understand the implementation of this from a structured standpoint, legalistically, theologically, ethically, spiritually, has a order to it that the process goes hand in hand with the state of our overall maturation. And you start to get to a place where the benefits that can only be derived through having access to the knowledge is not enough, but then going out and learning it so that you can start to determine for yourself where and how do I relate to these things. And it's crazy. I went to speak at a conference some years ago that had a bunch of college students at it. Some of you are in college, some of you have gone to college, some of you have gone to higher levels of education, masters, doctorates, all of these kinds of things. MashaAllah, may Allah increase you in it. Some of us have not done that. That's not a metric of success. There's a lot that goes into it, but just understanding now capacity and contextualizing in this anecdote, where I'm talking to people, a group of kids from the South had come to this conference. They're in their 20s to late 20s, and one said, hey, after the next session is done, can I ask you something? And I said, okay. And we're in a theater style place. Everybody empties out. I'm waiting for this guy, and as he's like about to talk to me, like 30 other people walk in, and they all just sit down in this space. And I say to them, like, well, what's going on? And they said, just tell us something. And I said, just tell you something. And they're like, give us a lecture. And I was like, no, I just did that. Like, what is about to happen here? And they said, we don't really have access to so many people where we come from. Can you just give us some insight on something? And I said, what do you want me to give you insight on? And then automatically they said, tell us how to get people to stop doing things that are un-Islamic. And I said, like what? And they're like, you know, haram things. And I was like, what? I was like, I don't know, what are you all doing down at the South? That's so crazy, right? And they said, you know, like haram, like they're listening to this, or when a boy talks to a girl. And it was a woman that was talking to me. And I said, I don't know if you know, but I'm a man and you're a woman and you're talking to me. Is this haram? And she said, what do you mean? And I said, what does the word haram mean? And she said, something is haram when it hurts you. And I said, if you told me right now that my father was sent to the hospital and it caused me pain, did you do something haram? And she said, no. And I said, then that's not what the word haram means, right? And you get to a place where you have the capacity to excel in your educational endeavors so that you can both aspire but actually attain a master's, a doctorate, a GED, a bachelor's, whatever it is that you get. But then when it comes to your religious knowledge, you stopped at Sunday school when you were 10 years old. or all you're giving to people now is Sunday school trivia information, do's and don'ts, rights and wrongs, why would religion feel thrilling to you? Why would it be exciting? Why would it be exhilarating? A lot of people turn away from religion because of religious people. This is a generalization I'm comfortable making. Because the overt focus becomes now only on this one aspect of what is outward and external. Somebody should be, if you are going to adopt the sunnah in such a way where you're going to dress the way the Prophet dressed, you're going to eat how he ate, you're going to look at hadith that say this companion sat in this spot under this tree. And why did you sit there? When they ask him this, and he says, I sat here because I saw the messenger of God sit here once. You're going to adopt the recommended sunnah, prophetic, emphasized practices in that way. Great. You should also get angry about the things the Prophet got angry about. He got angry at racism. He got angry at domestic violence. He got angry at abuse. If you don't get angry by these things, where is the love that can only come from adopting what is the prophetic practice on this? Does that make sense? When you get to these places where you can start to distill why there is now a jump from what is just mere foundational obligation to starting to think out, all of these deeds are going to end up in boxes of some kind anyway, where I need to have a presence, and I start to bring knowledge into it. So I'm not hurting myself or hurting somebody else in terms of what it is that I'm telling them is religion when it necessarily isn't, or I'm using terms loosely that don't apply necessarily. How can you be a Muslim for 30, 40 years of your life and you get to a place where you don't have a definition for these words that have been thrown in your face? And just like anything else, people will then manipulate them to hold them against you. Do you see what I mean? Does this make sense? So you start to adopt a practice that is rooted in this. What I'd like you to do is take 2 minutes. What are you taking away from this so far? This aspect of knowledge relevant to this structure, and then we'll come back and discuss. Go ahead. Okay, so what are some of the things we're taking away right now? What are some of the things that are coming up? Anybody? What did we discuss? Yeah.
So we were talking about part of the discussion that was talking about at the end of our lives we're going to be presented with this book, and for some people it will be emptier than others. So it got to us thinking about, well, the mindless activities that are done on a daily level, they may not seem like much on a daily level, but they can really add up. And it seems to be a symptom of emptiness in our lives. What can we do to fix that problem so that our book can be filled with good things?
Yeah, and filled with good things, but bring specificity to it, right? Here are acts that when you do them, they increase love. This is what the point is of it. So you start to reframe and shift the paradigm on what the word fard means, on what the word mustahab means. It's not burdensome, it's liberating. It has a point to it. It's meant to yield this thing. It's not the thing that is hard for me to do or is a distraction or creates like a challenge, but I start to use language that is rooted in what it actually is. So when somebody says to you, like, why do you wake up to pray at sunrise? You actually are able to have a base to it that isn't reactive to a supremacist society that constantly has you explaining who you are, while it's totally fine doing what it does without ever having to explain why it is that they do the things that they do. You're in a place where you know, like, what's the point of the exercise? I know if I run up and down the stairs, this is what it does for me physically. Here is now the spiritual yield. So the word good is too ambiguous. Until you get to a place, you keep saying the definition again and again and again. that allows for the self-talk to shift the paradigm inwardly that says, I cannot miss praying Fajr. You know who experienced this is a lot? Some of you have gone to Umrah with us when we've gone to Mecca and Medina, right? May Allah accept from us and enable us to visit his house in Makkatul Mukarramah and the illuminated city of the Prophet, Madinatul Munawwara, again and again. And may he end any of the oppression and injustice that comes out from these lands or the governments of these lands. But in being able to understand, we take people for Umrah. They're in Medina, they're in Mecca. People at various levels of relationship to their faith. No judgment aside, for a lot of them, when they sleep through a prayer for the first time because they're exhausted, they've taken a flight over, walking miles every day, praying Qiyam for the first time in their lives, there's a different barakah that's there. It starts to catch up. And they sleep through, like Dhuhr. They didn't even miss it. They're travelers. They could pray it later if they needed to. And it's not even that they missed it together. They just missed being in the Jama'ah. And it hurts. It's because you're open to the experience and it's creating love now. And when you're depriving yourself of love in that moment, your heart's going to hurt. Do you get what I'm saying? When you have that, you can relate to it. Ramadan time, the last 10 days are different from the first 10 days. The ability to stay up late at night is a little bit different than in the first part of the night. Good is not ambiguous. Good is rooted in something that's experiential. That's what spirituality is. It's different from just rote memorization of practice and creed, because you can memorize those things. This is something that you just look to yourself and you understand it. Why do you feel what you feel going into the 27th night of Ramadan versus going into the 10th night of any other random month, Safar? You don't even know when Safar is on the Islamic calendar. You know what I mean? But you're feeling consequently the impact of love that's giving you energy. That's what love does. It gives you strength. It gives you capacity that you can't even imagine. So if you start to name it and specify it for what it is, then it's going to be that much more tangible that, hey, this is why we do these things. This is what it brings to us. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Let's jump to the paragraph that says, the knowledge obligatory upon every Muslim is to know. Can somebody start to read that? Yeah, go ahead, Shal.
The knowledge obligatory upon every Muslim is to know the mandatory status of those things which Allah has made obligatory, and the forbidden status of those which Allah has forbidden. As for knowing the way to perform each obligation, this becomes obligatory only at the time of wanting to perform it. The one who reaches puberty or enters Islam in the month of Ramadan, for instance, must immediately learn the meaning of the two affirmations and utter them, and then learn about the method of performing the 5 prayers and their necessary components and rules. He must then learn about the obligation of fasting, the zakat, the pilgrimage, and so forth, and about the prohibition of adultery, wine drinking, the wrongful appropriation of other people's wealth, and the other things forbidden by them. It is not necessary for him to learn precisely how to fast or perform the Hajj until Ramadan or Hajj time arrives, nor how to calculate the zakat until he has enough money for the zakat to become due and its time for it. And Allah knows best.
Okay, so it's giving you a set criteria. The general window is this first bucket of obligatory knowledge. You have to know in specific, how does Islam apply to you in your given stage of life? So what is mandatory and what is prohibited upon you in your stage of life? How does it relate to you? And that's you in your entirety. You can't compartmentalize. What does it say about you as a person who's an entrepreneur, an artist, an academic? What does it say to you as a child, as a parent, and everything in between? What does it say to you as somebody who invests money in something, somebody who has a certain job title, right? This is a box of information. If you didn't know it yesterday, all you got to start doing is try to know it today. The journey in and of itself is a deep value, even in comparison to a destination. And our tradition tells us this again and again and again. The man who takes the lives of 99 people and seeks to get forgiveness for it and is told you won't be forgiven, and then takes the life of another and then speaks to somebody who's more learned and says that you can be forgiven, but you have to leave from this town where you committed these acts and go to this other town. And as they go to the other town, they pass away in the midst of the journey. And the angels are sent down to take them. And one group of angels says, we got to take them to chastisement because they didn't make it to the town. And the other says, no, they were on their way to the place of redemption. And when they ask Allah, Allah says that if the body is closer to the second town, then bring them to Jannah. If the body is closer to the first town where they committed the bad deeds, then take them to Jahannam. And they come and they measure and they see that the body is closer to the second town. And what the hadith says in some narrations, the body is actually closer to the first town, but out of His mercy, Allah makes it seem that it's closer to the second town. You have a God that wants you to succeed. That's what all of it keeps telling us again and again and again. But for the point of this, you don't want to become overwhelmed or inundated that says, I don't know where to start, where do I go? You just start and then you try your best. The guy didn't make it to the second town. He still gets to Jannah, but at least he's trying to get to where he can. Abdullah takes the had punishment for drinking alcohol. He doesn't overcome it. He still is said through the words of the Prophet to refute those who speak poorly of him that he loves Allah and His Messenger. You just get up and try again and try again and try while you have capacity to try. It's very different from sitting back and saying, I'm just not going to do anything at all. As he's done in other chapters, he's giving you now a list of things that have actual meaning and separation. You can make bullet points. So box number 1, how is it obligatory upon you and what is prohibited to you? And then he continues, knowing the way to perform each obligation. This is only obligatory at the time of wanting to perform it, meaning that when you have to do it, that's when you have to know how to do it, right? So my 8-year-old, he doesn't have to know how to pray right now. It's not fard upon him. Is it easier to teach him now so that when it comes, yeah, if somebody takes their shahada, they're going to have to pray the prayer that has come in. They're now Muslim. And one of the qualities of having it be fard upon you is that you are sane, post-pubescent, and Muslim. Somebody who's not Muslim, Sharia doesn't apply to them in the ways that it applies to somebody who's Muslim. There's also a process of teaching so that you don't overwhelm somebody. So when we teach people on Wednesday nights how to pray at a class that we have for new Muslims, we get about 5 people a week who take their shahada at our center, alhamdulillah, right? And we're teaching them how to systematically learn prayer. In the Hanafi school, for example, you have what is fard, wajib, and sunnah in a prayer. And in the fard, what are the integral components of the prayer are just a lot of the physical movements, and then you only have to say one short verse of the Quran. Not the Fatiha. There's nothing that you have to say in the bowing, the kneeling, any of these things. The shortest verse in the Quran says, Thumma nadhir, and then he looked. In the Hanafi school, if you have a legally valid reason as to why that's the way you would pray, then that's how you would pray. For the guy that just became Muslim, who might not have even known that there's 5 prayers in Islam, they're going to have a reason. And then they're working their way reasonably to learning the rest of it. Do you see what I'm saying? If you are a teacher of somebody, then you have to know how to teach also. And just because you're doing it doesn't mean you know how to teach it. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? That's how bucket 1 relates to this bucket 2, right? The person has to be in this place. So what becomes obligatory then? The community has to be able to provide for individuals that can meet the needs of the diversity of the community. So you need people who are skilled at mental health to be able to deal with mental health issues. You need people who are not going to just throw around words that they don't know what it means and then make it worse for individuals. You build out these services. You don't have to know how to do it, but you fulfill the communal obligations of some of these things, right? So here in bucket point number 2, it starts to become on you in a order. You got to know what the Shahada is. In Sunni Islam, it's a pillar of Islam. It's a pillar of practice. So if somebody asks you, what does it mean, the Shahada? You're not Muslim because your parents are Muslim. It's not an inherited religion. The theology is a discursive theology. You have to be able to explain why you believe what you believe in. And you can't believe something just because somebody else believes it. You could dress how somebody else dresses. Tomorrow, you could all walk in wearing an Islamic Center at NYU shirt. We could all dress exactly the same. It doesn't mean we all believe the same things. Belief is in your heart. So you start to distill here, right? And you go at a pace. What does the Shahada mean? How is this actually a pillar of practice, the testimony of faith? Because it's a little different from your prayer, which has mechanics to it. Why is this a pillar of Islam and not an article of faith, Iman? Do you get what I'm saying? And then he goes through it and says also about the generic prohibitions, right? What are things that are just categorically forbidden across the board? Sometimes people don't know. There's a hadith in the Muwatta where a companion of the Prophet comes to the Prophet and gives him a gift of a bottle of wine. He didn't know. The Prophet says to him, not like all kinds of harshness, the Prophet is sent as a mercy. So he explains to him. And so the man tells the guy who works for him, go sell it in the marketplace. And the Prophet says, you can't do that either, man. But people don't know things. And how will they know? Well, you got to start to learn it. And it's not that you are just going to be assessed based off of what you know. You're also going to be assessed based on what you have the capacity to know. It's not just what you do or choose to not do, but it's what you have the ability to do. And then here, you don't have to know about Ramadan until it's Ramadan time. You don't have to know about Hajj until Hajj becomes something that is relevant and applicable to you. The main duties and prohibitions, as he continues, are well known amongst Muslims. The important thing, however, is to know the various rules which can only be acquired from a scholar who fears Allah and upholds the truth. The commonality are sometimes right and sometimes mistaken, so beware of doing what they do and leaving what they leave by emulation, for emulation can be sound only if it is of a scholar who practices that which he knows, and such people are today a rarity. This is why if you've ever sat at Jummah, for example, and somebody takes their Shahada at the IC, right? Some of you have seen this happen. One of the things that I'll say to them on occasion is just because a Muslim is telling you it, doesn't mean that it's true. Because everybody doesn't know everything. And everybody also doesn't know how to apply it to somebody coming in a certain situation. Therefore, if you see a scholar these days and observing doing or leaving something, and you do not know whether this is right or wrong, do not be content with just having seen what he does or refrain from doing. Ask him about the legal reasoning and the religious rules behind it. There's no shortage of online learning sources, not online fatwa websites, not where you Google, what does Islam say about X, Y, or Z, and then you read something that didn't take you into consideration. But you can get on Zooms, have real conversations, take structured classes and curricula in real time with people where you can actually ask questions, not take your Islam and do a search that then says what this website tells you that makes you either feel like you're the greatest and everybody else is terrible, or it makes you feel like you're the worst thing in the world and everything else is better than you. Both are delusional understandings of self. A superiority and inferiority understanding is not what our religion espouses. a delusional sense of grandeur, a delusional sense of insignificance. We adopt interiority in our reflection. I'm not in competition with anybody else. It's just me looking within me, and the I that is me today is not afraid to meet the person I can become tomorrow. So you start to root it in actual knowledge base. What does that mean? Sometimes the religion that your parents teach you, it's not what Islam says. Sometimes the practices of your grandparents, of your friend, that's not what it's going to be. The number of people that I sit with who convert to Islam, who they take Islam from Muslims, and they are told things that just fundamentally are not what Islam says. It's not a knock on anybody, but it means that people are not learning what the religion is actually rooted in and based upon sometimes. Sometimes you got to unlearn things before you can learn certain things. And so you go and you ask people who actually know. A Muslim does not need a long time to acquire the knowledge that is obligatory for him, nor is much hardship involved. An intelligent student will find it sufficient to sit with a proficient scholar for an hour or two. A Bedouin once came to the Messenger of God ﷺ while he was preaching from his pulpit and asked him to teach him some of that which God had taught him. He descended from his pulpit, taught him, then returned to it and completed his sermon. When we can relate these chapters all together, and you bring structure, the chapter on awrad, time management, and you start to build into your routine, the entry point to Islam is not up here. The entry point, the bar of entry to this religion, it's really low because it claims that everybody can be Muslim from any background, from all walks of life until the end of time. It can't be hard. But if you're telling yourself, I don't have the time to do it, you're saying it's not important to me. And that's a decision you can make. But you can find 10 minutes, 20 minutes, an hour in a day. There's not so much that you need. In terms of theology, people say if you know Surah Ikhlas and what it means, like what it actually means, not as translation, what it's actually teaching you, that can suffice you in terms of your need of knowing what you need to know about God. It doesn't take a while to learn like how to pray or like the spiritual aspects of it. You just got to build in the time, and then you actually find people who are willing to make time for you. Look at how beautiful the messenger of God is. A person comes to him and says, teach me something. And in the midst of all of it, he descends from the mimbar and actually teaches this person something, and then goes back and finishes it. Somebody doesn't have time to respond to your email, they're lying to you. Everybody has time to do it. If you call a masjid and they don't pick up the phone and return your call, then you got to find another place that's going to treat you and your heart as a priority. It doesn't answer the question of how you prioritize yourself, but there are people who will make the time for you. You have to allow for yourself to also make that something that makes sense. And there's different people who have different ways. When I was trying to study Quran with some shuyukh, they said come after Fajr. So I came after Fajr because that's what the Sheikh said. That's what we would do. Some of you don't have the ability to go after Fajr. Not because you don't want to, but that's not how your day and your structure is routine. There's other people that you can work with that would allow for you to do some of these things, conducive to your schedule. There's really not inaccessibility to knowledge at this point in time. The challenge is overt accessibility and not knowing how to distill it. The go-between is getting somebody who can explain to you, this is what this actually means, so it doesn't throw you into a frenzy and a state that creates a lot more difficulty. On the whole, those who want security and gain must not initiate any act or continue in something already initiated until they know God's ruling in its regard. Whether it is obligatory, recommended, just licit, or prohibited, everything will fall into one of those four groups. This must surely be a duty for every Muslim.
Believers can be divided into the commonality and the elect. The former may fall into the neglect of duties and the committing of forbidden things. They are not keen on supererogatory devotions, and they use the merely licit category of things to excess. The best amongst them are those who hasten to repent and ask for forgiveness. As for the elect, they carry out their obligations and avoid prohibitions under all circumstances. They are also careful to perform the recommended things and confine themselves when using what is licit to that which is a means of conforming to God's orders and prohibitions, and God is the one who grants success. What this is giving is not a stratification of society within a Muslim communal experience. It's telling the individual this is what characteristically can become a metric of assessment for you as a person. If you want to know that your heart is in a spiritually elevated state, then you're going to be somebody who does what is obligatory, avoids the prohibited, and also you have a certain mindfulness in engaging in what is recommended. And if you're somebody who your heart's not in that place, then you're going to be kind of going at the other end of the spectrum. You just look to yourself to understand yourself, but you don't hate on yourself or hate on anybody else. The only times the Prophet of God got upset with somebody that was doing haram was when they were hurting somebody else. They were abusive, they were racist, they were oppressive. His companions were people that were spiritually elevated, the best of generations. And they also were people that made mistakes. That's why love has to be an integral part to this. The love of God, the love of others, but also learning how to love yourself in a healthy way. So that you're kind enough to be able to engage in reflection that doesn't have you now in a place where you make justifications for things that are inevitably still hurting you in a way that you shouldn't hurt yourself. So I'd like for us to do, just as we close out, Maghrib is going to be in a few minutes. If you can turn to the person next to you, what are some of the things that we're taking away from this chapter on how we engage, like the obligations? How do we understand its role in our life? Where are some things that I could start off with? What are some things that come up for me that might be a little bit tough to overcome as I'm getting over that hurdle to get going? But once you get going, it's still spiritual exercise. It's like the person who has to get up to will themselves to start exercising physically. But the moment you start doing it, you start to get up with more ease. You start to do it with more regularity. That's just how we're built. But what are some of the things we're taking away from this? And then we'll kind of discuss, and we'll take a pause for Maghrib and stuff. So go ahead. You can talk to the persons next to you. Okay. So what are some of the things we're taking away from today's conversation? What's coming up for people before we wrap up? Yeah.
One insight that we were discussing, and this thought came to my mind when you were talking earlier, is that it is mentioned a lot in the Quran that some of the old people, their mistake was that they said, this is what we found our fathers doing, and this is what we're going to do. They were not Muslims, they were from other religions that prophets came to them, and they didn't follow them because they were like, hey, this is what I found my father doing, this is what I'm going to do. And Quran stated these actions or this mindset as a wrong thing to do. And I just think that we're not an exception. Not because we think that we're following the right religion, then we are an exception to the rule that no one should do that. Because if so, then maybe more than half of these people that said this sentence were actually thinking that they're following the right thing, but they didn't do the effort to study what is out there to know whether or not it was wrong. So yeah, we're just not an exception to the rule that was mentioned in the Quran.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Anything? Yeah.
I like how you mentioned that if you look at your first prayer or anything that you're supposed to do as like a to-do list or as something that you just need to get done with, it's always gonna seem like an obstacle. me just because it's going to be good for my mental health. It's going to be, it helps me speak to Allah spiritually. Then you can enjoy the process. And like you said, you'll be able to explain to someone too that, why you get up at 4 a.m. to go to prayer. So,
Any other thoughts? Takeaways? Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.
We hope you enjoyed our podcast. If you're inspired by the work that we're doing at the IC and want to help keep it going, subscribe to our podcasts, follow us on social media, donate to help support us at ICNYU.org, and most importantly, keep us in your continued du'as. Until next time, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.